10 Bacteria, the symptom, not the cause, of a disease. We are taking a very superficial view of the matter if we imagine that diseases are caused by all the flora, and also fauna, as we shall see, that appear in the intestine or anywhere else in the human organism. It is really terrible to start to examine the literature on pathology today. In every chapter you come across statements about the discovery that this bacterium is associated with this disease or that bacterium with that disease, and so forth. All of these facts are extremely interesting as far as the botany and zoology of the human intestines are concerned, but none of it has any significance for illness except possibly as a sign that allows us to recognize the disease. Because when one or the other form of disease is present, the human organism can be said to offer one or the other interesting little animal or plant a substrate upon which it can develop. It does not mean anything more than this. The growth of microscopic fauna and flora has very little to do with the actual disease, only indirectly, if at all. 11. Directing attention to the habitat, not the bacteria. The presence of these interesting creatures tells us only that the habitat suits them, nothing more. We need to focus on studying this habitat. Of course, it can happen that the bacterial invasion provokes a well-prepared habitat to succumb to disease processes of its own accord. In reality, however, current bacteriological studies have nothing to do with the study of disease. 12. Too much sleep predisposes towards epidemic illnesses. We have noticed the occurrence of so-called epidemic illnesses which take hold of whole swaths of a population and therefore also have social implications. The customary materialistic sciences study these epidemics with reference to the human organism, but they know nothing about the immensely important role that is played in connection with epidemics and the predisposition towards them by the abnormal conduct of human beings in connection with waking up and going to sleep. There is something which takes place in the organism when a human being is asleep, something which, if there is too much of it, thoroughly predisposes a person towards the so-called epidemic diseases. Individuals who, through sleeping too much, bring about processes in their organism that should not be there, because sleep ought not to interrupt waking life for such long periods, have an altogether different predisposition towards epidemic illnesses, and they also enter into an epidemic in an entirely different way. You can imagine the difficulty of explaining to people about the proper ratio between sleeping and waking. Nothing can be achieved by means of rules and regulations analogous to stipulations regarding, for example, not sending one's children to school if they have scarlet fever. Of course, it is important to ensure that those who need to are able to sleep for 7 hours while those who do not need so much may sleep for shorter periods and so on. Nevertheless, matters that are so intimately bound up with the most personal aspects of human life do have very great social consequences. 13. Fixing attention on the bacteria distracts us from the primary causes of disease. In recent times the tendency has become ever more pronounced to disregard the actual causes and to look at surface occurrences. A phenomenon related to this superficiality is the fact that whenever we begin to read or hear a description of any type of illness, current medicine or pathology almost always informs us about what has invaded the human organism, about what kind of bacterium provokes the illness in question. It is terribly easy, of course, to repudiate any objections to the idea of lower organisms invading the body for the simple reason that it is no longer necessary first to prove that these lower organisms are present. Since distinct forms of microorganisms are indeed evident in different illnesses, the tendency to suggest a connection is quite understandable. But even on a superficial level, this view gives rise to an error that actually completely distracts us from the main issue. If bacteria appear in numbers in a certain part of the body in the course of an illness, they naturally provoke symptoms, as do any foreign bodies in the organism. As a result of the presence of these bacteria, all kinds of inflammations appear. But if we then attribute everything to the activity of the bacteria, directing our attention only to what the bacteria are doing, we are distracted from the true cause of the disease. Because any habitat that lower organisms find suitable for their own development within the human body is brought about by the primary causes. For once we need to pay attention to the domain of primary causes. 14. Confusing cause with effect. If someone's knowledge obliges him to maintain that the primary cause of an illness involving bacteria is something more profound than those bacteria, this does not mean that he is denying the presence of the bacteria. It is altogether different to point out that the bacteria are present and that they arise due to the illness, rather than maintaining that the bacteria are the primary cause. Let us imagine looking at a landscape full of beautiful, well-cared-for cattle. I might then ask, why are these particular living conditions present in this region? And I might answer, These conditions are brought about by these beautiful cattle. In saying this, I would be declaring that the living conditions in the region result from the arrival of the cattle which have multiplied here. But I would not say such a thing, would I? I would look for the primary causes, the diligence and understanding of the country folk, and this would explain why these beautiful cattle are flourishing on this land. I would be making a superficial statement if I were to say only, it is nice here, it's a good place to live because these beautiful cattle have arrived here. 15 Primary and secondary causes. If we survey modern allopathic medicine, we invariably find that it tends to evaluate patients with a view to the concomitant phenomena described by the bacterial theory of infection. This diverts our attention to a secondary issue. As a mere aid to recognition, the natural history of bacteria would be extremely useful. We can indeed learn a lot from the type of bacterium that is present, because a certain type always appears under the influence of a very specific primary cause. There is always plenty of opportunity to see this connection, but there is a tendency to mistake a secondary factor for the primary cause, as when, for example, we look at the extent to which the bacteria affect human organs instead of the extent to which the human organism can become a habitat for bacteria. Such a tendency appears not only in allopathic medical theories concerning bacteria, but also in that whole way of thinking. Consequently, this tendency causes damage that I need not elucidate, since many of you have noticed it yourselves. 16 Bacteria are everywhere, but they thrive where there is a source of infection. We have a constant interchange of life, giving air when we breathe in and death bringing air when we breathe out. Living and dying are constantly within us. And you will agree that it is very interesting to see how this living and dying becomes a part of the human being. To help you understand this, let me draw your attention to the fact that minute living creatures, bacteria, are present everywhere in nature. Countless such living creatures are flying all around us as we walk along, surrounded by the air. A muscle taken from an animal is full of countless tiny living creatures, and these tiny living creatures have the characteristic of multiplying hugely. One alone will scarcely have arrived before there are millions, especially of those that are smallest. They multiply hugely. The so-called infectious diseases rest on this. Not that these tiny living creatures cause the disease, but as soon as something in us falls sick, these tiny living creatures thrive. Like plants growing on manure, these minute living creatures thrive within us in organs that are sick. They like being there. Anyone claiming that diseases come from the tiny living creatures, saying, perhaps, that influenza comes from the flu bacterium, might just as well maintain that the rain comes from the frogs he can hear croaking. Of course the frogs croak when it rains, since being in the water they sense the rain's arrival and the stimulus it brings. The frogs do not bring the rain just as the bacteria do not bring influenza, but they are present where flu is present just as the frogs inexplicably appear when the rain comes. So on the one hand we should not say that researching bacteria is pointless. They do after all show that human beings are susceptible to disease, just as the frogs croak when it rains. We should not throw the baby out with the bathwater by saying that researching bacteria is unnecessary, but on the other hand we ought to know that the bacteria do not cause the illness. It will never be correct to declare that there are bacteria for cholera and bacteria for influenza and so on. To do this is pure laziness because we cannot be bothered to investigate the true causes of disease. 7.